in which they build a life together. Sorry, let me just say that I am fine with this being recorded, right? In which they build a life together in which we presume that they are having an intimate relationship, but they may not have actually had a Jewish marriage. Now, obviously, that's germane to what I'm doing because I'm looking for some other ways to do that, right, without imposing a Jewish marriage on them. But we'll circle back to that in a bit, right? Okay, so I have the sources lined up on my other screen. So I'm going to try screen sharing and letting you see these sources, and we will see how this goes. All right, can everybody see that? We are not a large group, so please feel free to break in at any time if you have a question. Okay, so number one, let's just start with how does Jewish marriage traditionally work, at least since the rabbinic period, right? Actually, let me back up a sec. Some of you may be married right now. Some of you may have been married at one time. Some of you may hope to be married someday. Take a moment and just think for me, what like images or metaphors might you use just for what an ideal marriage ought to be? A marriage is a partnership. A marriage is best friends. Just throw some things out there. A marriage or a life partnership is. You can put it in chat, you can say it. Trust, marrying your best friend, right? So I imagine there are people talk about it's a mutual journey that we go on together. It's an adventure, right? It's support, it's common goals, it's a merging of resources, right? Yeah, there are very, very practical elements to marriage, right? Maybe it's a task, right? Marriage is something you have to work at sometimes. It's a job, among other things. Okay, so now I'm just going to close the chat for myself. Let's look at what the Mishnah, which is the earliest work of rabbinic Judaism. I would say this is a work that is what we call redacted. That means it was sort of edited and put together and collected. Traditionally, we say it was written by a man named Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Patriarch, who was the head of the Jewish community. It may be that he did it. It may be that he, kind of gave it his imprimatur. It may be that it just kind of came together among a group of rabbis. Less important to me who wrote it than that this will become the early central work of rabbinic Judaism. And we think it came together around, let's say, 200 of the Common Era. Okay. So this is the Mishnah in a tractate called Kiddushin, and it says this. This is the very first paragraph of this Mishnah. A woman is acquired, niknate, we'll talk about that word again more in a moment, in three ways, and she acquires herself by two, right? Konad atzma. She is acquired by money, by document, or by sexual intercourse, right? And then the rabbis talk about how much, what does the thing that is used as the money in this transaction. We'll talk about how the transaction works in a moment, but how much does that have to be worth? And you can see that the house of Shammai say it should be a fairly significant sum, right? Whereas Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, say that it should be a very small sum. A pruta in rabbinic literature is basically the smallest amount of coinage that counts still as money. Think of a penny or maybe a nickel in our day. The smallest thing that counts as money. So it becomes, in one sense, according to Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, a token, because it's not what a person is worth, if you could quantify what a person was worth. Right? On the other hand, it creates the marriage, so it's very, very crucial. Okay, very quickly, I just want to show you. There's a word that does or should jump out to you here, and is the word that jumped out to me and started this whole project. right? And that is the term, of course, niknet. Liknot in both rabbinic and modern Hebrew can mean to purchase something. It can also mean to acquire it by other means, right? And I will say honestly, right, we describe, for example, God as konesh shamayim va'aretz. God, sort of owns, as it were, is the master of heaven and earth. So it's a very multivalent word, a word with a lot of meanings, but it does seem to have the sense acquire. And so I just want to show you the next couple of paragraphs from, or at least the openings of the next couple of paragraphs in the Mishnah. And you'll see there are other things that can be acquired, such as a slave who was born Jewish. There are various circumstances in which someone becomes, it's more like an indentured servant. You serve for a 6-year term. It can be if you have debts you can't repay, if you've got caught stealing and you can't return or pay back the object that you stole. There are some circumstances in which somebody can sell himself or his daughter. A man can sell his daughter, not his son. All right. You can acquire a Canaanite slave. That means any slave whose origins are not Jewish, which was probably the majority of slaveholding in the world of late antiquity. And yes, it was a slaveholding world. Romans held slaves, Greeks held slaves, Jews held slaves. People across the southern the southern shore of the Mediterranean held slaves. Everybody held slaves. Okay. You can acquire a large animal. You can acquire small animals. You can acquire real estate. You can acquire inanimate, movable things, furniture, utensils, clothing, pottery, vases, etc., grain, right? Food stuff, etc., etc. And notice that in each of these cases, we're using variants of the same word. Nikneh, masculine singular for the slave, right? Niknet for the animal. Animal happens to be a feminine word in Hebrew and Hebrew grammar, right? Mortgage, real estate, niknin, that's just the plural, etc., etc. Okay, so what's the metaphor here? Please jump in. There's a metaphor here, right, of acquisition. Now we'll have to ask sort of what exactly is it that one acquires, right? But yes, you're right. Ownership, material transactions, right? It's transactional. And now if you stop and think about property, right? Yes, stop and think about money, right? So that's a very interesting term. Okay, now I want to take you to a related text. This text is called the Toscefta. The word Tosefta in Hebrew basically means like an addition. This is another text from approximately the same period as the Mishnah. And it's unclear exactly how in full everything in it relates. There's probably multiple ways in which the material in it relates, but broadly our kind of our theory about it is it's stuff that didn't make it into the Mishnah. Sometimes it's stuff that possibly is the prior sources out of which Mishnaic sources were more carefully shaped. Sometimes it's the earliest levels of commentary. Sometimes it's just extraneous extra stuff that didn't get in, but it's from the same time period. And so to later rabbis, as we'll see in a little bit, to later rabbis, it's a roughly almost equal authority because it's from the same time period and the same people. So you'll see here, the text kind of functions, at least in theory, like a commentary, like a first commentary on what we just saw in the Mishnah. All right. So first it cites the Mishnah. A woman is acquired in 3 ways, right? Money, document, and sexual intercourse. Okay, but so now you want to know, how exactly does that work, right? What exactly do you do? by money. He gives her money or something equivalent to money. In other words, he gives her something that's a pruta or worth a pruta. And he says to her, behold, you are betrothed to me with this. Mikudeshet, different word. Or he says, mi'oreset, you are mi'oreset to me. Or you are my wife with this, right? Then what happens? She is mikudeshet. So everybody notice that the vocabulary changes here? What do you think that's about? How might niknate, she is acquired, and mikudeshet be connected or not? Anybody see? I don't know how much Hebrew background each of you have, but does anybody know if I say what's the root of that word? Will somebody know what I'm asking and know what the answer is?
Well, it looks like kadosh.
Kadosh, yes, it does look like kadosh, holy, or to be set aside, right? All right, so I'm going to challenge you a little bit more on Hebrew grammar. Those of you, anybody know what kind of forms these words are in? Hebrew does an interesting, hekdesh. We're going to come back to hekdesh in a moment. Good, I like that. Somebody is anticipating. Right? Hebrew works through a structure. You have a root for various words, verbs, and then sometimes they also become nouns, right? Usually 3, sometimes 4 letters, all kinds of weird things that happen. But then you put them through what's called a series of binyanim, structures, and which binyan you use will then affect the meaning of the word, right? So a lot of words are just in the very basic. There's 2 kind of very basic binyanim. They just mean basic things. Although even those can have nuances. So for example, you take a word like lishbor means to break something. Lishaber, same root, you see the shin, bet, resh, shabara, right? Lishaber means to shatter it, right? But they're both like basic things. But then you can also have versions that are passive. And I think that's very important here because if you notice, right, what happens here when a woman is acquired, she's niknate. That is a passive form. She is acquired. She does not do the acquiring. She is what is acquired, right? So similarly, right, what does a man do? He gives her, and he says she is mikudeshet. That's another passive form, a slightly different version. She is becoming betrothed. Not she has betrothed him, not they are engaged, right? It's not a mutual. She has become betrothed. She has become, a mi'oreset is a biblical term for the same thing, right? So notice, right now we're going to go to clause B right here, right? If she gives him the money, and if she says to him, even if she uses the passive form, I am betrothed to you. I am mi'oreset to you. I am your wife. Doesn't work, right? The other thing I want you to notice, right, is we start with a woman is acquired. How is she acquired? When she is acquired, what's the word we use? Mikudeshet. So mikudeshet, even though it's a different word, in some way is functioning like niknate here, right? The 2 are somehow equivalent in this text. But it does have additional meanings of kedusha. Maybe also, though, hekdesh, somebody mentioned the word hekdesh. Hekdesh is property you dedicate to God or to the temple, right? So I go out one day and I'm standing out in my field and I don't know, tree falls over and nearly hits me, but it misses me. And I go, oh, wonderful. And I look at my herd that's standing out there. I go, I am so thankful that I have just been saved from that falling tree that I'm going to dedicate that beautiful cow over there to God as a sacrifice. That cow becomes hekdesh. Notice again the root kadash. And interestingly, there's some interesting rules about now that I have dedicated that cow, there's a whole lot of things I can't do. I can't use it. I can't milk it. I can't, if it's a sheep, I can't shear it. I can't work it. I can't use it to plow my field. I can't do anything. It belongs to God now. So just kind of keep that in mind. Interesting thing, right? Somebody else, it belongs to God, but it's not like things that typically belong. Right? Like if I buy, right, Rabbi Freller, doesn't need a set of books and he sells them to me. And I open up the package and I go, oh, that wasn't what I thought it is. Or like, oh, wait, actually, I already have one of those on my shelf. So I, in turn, can go right ahead and sell it to one of my students or to one of my colleagues, right? I can loan it to somebody. Not so clear what you can do, obviously, with a spouse, right? So one theory here is that what are you acquiring? You're acquiring, in a sense, exclusive access. Or what is the man acquiring? He's acquiring exclusive access to the woman, particularly sexually and reproductively. Although I should say, right, he also then, there are property relations that happen and there are obligations that he takes on. So it's a little more complicated than that. But one of the primary things that happens is he and only he has sexual access to her. Now, is it mutual? Does she have sexual access? Can she demand exclusivity of him? No. I see shaking heads. The shaking heads are correct. Right? We know biblically that Judaism allows for polygyny, marriage of a man and more than one woman, right? And it's not clear to us historically what was actually happening in rabbinic communities in this time period, but at least in theory, the rabbis understand that a man is allowed to have more than one wife. Okay, you can just see, right, also here's the, if it's a document, how do you do with a document? You write it on something, right? And you say in the document, you are betrothed to me by this document. The importance of the potsherd or the blemished parchment here are that the thing you write on doesn't have to be worth a pruta because you're not betrothing by money. You're betrothing by the document. So that's the import of that, right? Sexual intercourse. This actually is important for the longer discussion that I can't do with you tonight, but, right? Sexual intercourse has to be with the purpose of creating marriage, right? So every time just two people sleep together, we don't necessarily say suddenly they are married, right? But if he and she go into a room together and they say to two people standing outside, we're going to create a marriage now, right? And they stay in the room together long enough that we presume that, yes, they went ahead and consummated this relationship, then we can presume that there has been kiddushin. Yes, great question in the chat. She has to consent in some way. Yes. I will say that for the rabbis, essentially, the rabbis have a concept that's called shtika kahodaya. If you don't object strenuously, then that tends to be counted as acceptance. So, for example, if you go to a very Orthodox wedding, you will see, right? By the way, a man hands a woman a ring. Which form of kiddushin are we doing, do you think?
Isn't the goal to get all three in the same night to cover all the bases?
Symbolically, yes. I'll tell you, yeah. But technically, right, what we're doing is we're doing kiddushin by means of money, right? The ring is a thing that is worth a pruta. And so, by the way, again, in Orthodox halacha, also conservative halacha, right, it has to belong to the husband to be at the moment that he gives it, or it must be from his property, right, to give to her. And he's giving her something that is the equivalent of money. Now, it's true, right? We also write a ketubah. The ketubah is not itself exactly a document that creates kiddushin, but it kind of stands in for that. And we symbolically nowadays, we send the couple off, many communities, off to a room together after the ceremony for 15 or 20 minutes to just kind of hang out together. And if they've been fasting, to eat. And just to be together as husband and wife. I've seen lots of jokey things where you put up people to guard the door. We have a fantastic picture from our wedding of, we have a very dear friend who is a neurologist, and he's up against the door with a stethoscope with like 5 or 6 guys gathered around him, in a big cluster trying to listen in with the stethoscope. I've seen people with Nerf guns outside of the door, that kind of thing. It's a fun, silly thing, but that is supposed to be symbolic of, it's not the actual betrothing by sexual intercourse, but it's symbolic of doing it that way also. So yes, we technically, legally betrothed by money, and then we symbolically also do the other two. Okay, but notice, that what's going on in, let me just scroll this back up a tiny bit. Who gives to whom, and who speaks or says something to whom? Notice he's speaking to her and he's giving the thing to her. All right, so now we're going to go to the Talmud. There's a very interesting question that comes up, right? If I was teaching a Talmud class, I'd be charting this or something, right? In the Toscefta and in the parallel version that appears in the Talmud right before the passage I'm about to show you, he gives the item and he says the text, right? And then it's kosher. Then they are betrothed. But if she gives the item and she says something, they are not. But there's a middle scenario here we could think about. What if, I'm not gonna be able to get it all on one screen, so we'll come back. What if she does one and he does one? Either she gives the money and he says something, or he gives the money and she says something. What if that happens? And the problem that the rabbis are going to have here is that they only have the two full-on cases and they don't know what to do with those middle cases, right? So one possibility, right, is that you need to have him do both, right? And if he doesn't do both, then they aren't betrothed. There's nothing binding. I should mention, this betrothal is a binding. This isn't just, all right, I've unfortunately, or maybe fortunately in the long run, I've had friends who've gotten engaged and then the engagement falls apart and the couple never get married. Right? I've had that happen to people I know. Probably for the best in the end. If you couldn't work things out before, better not to have to go through a divorce, but be that as it may, right? In American society and most Western society, when that happens, the two parties walk away, right? Maybe you bicker for a little bit about like any deposits you've already made to the caterer. You debate whether you should give the ring back or not, but there is nothing legally binding you to each other. You can literally walk away. Not so in Jewish law. When you've had kiddushin, you're not necessarily living together yet, but you are bound to each other. And if you want to break that off, there must be a divorce. And we know that in rabbinic times, it was actually, and in various periods in Jewish history, it was traditional to actually betroth well before the wedding. You betrothed maybe even up to a year in advance. And then that was a time for the man to prepare a household for the two of them, and for her to put together clothing and stuff to bring with her and gather a dowry and so on, right? But they are legally bound to each other during that time. If she were to have a relationship, a sexual relationship with somebody else, it would be legally adultery, even though she's never even consummated the relationship with the husband necessarily. So that's important to know, right? So whether they are actually bound to each other or not is a very important legal question. Okay, so Rav Papa's first thought is the Mishnah, the Toscefta, I should say, says he's got to do both, right? So, right, if he does one but not the other, they shouldn't be betrothed. But that creates a problem because the second part of the Toscefta says if she does both, they are not betrothed. That might imply, but if she does only one, they are. So which is it? What happens when one of them does one and one of them does the other? That's the part they don't know the answer to. Okay, one possibility. They're going to go through a couple of possibilities, right? If he does both, good, we're done. Commit. We've got binding kiddushin, right? But if he does only one and she does the other, it's as if she did both. Forget it, right? So no kiddushin. He's got to do both. Possibility 2. This is if you wish, alternate explanation. If he does both, good. We've got Kiddushin. If she does both, no, nothing happened. And if one of them does one and one of them does the other, well, then we've got a doubtful case. We're not sure they're betrothed. We might want to redo it if we want it to be binding, but it might be binding enough to make them do a divorce if they don't want it that way. Right? So we're at least concerned. We're not sure. We just genuinely don't know. But in a case where we don't know, we're probably going to make them do a divorce if they want to break up. Okay. So that's the starting point, right? The only time we're absolutely sure they're betrothed is when he is the fully active party and she is a passive party. That's important, right? He says that he gives the item or gives the document, and he states his intention, and as we've already documented, he is doing something that changes her status. He is laying an exclusive claim on her. Mikudeshet, niknate. Everybody with me so far? Right? So now one more interesting twist, right? That's going to emphasize that last point I just made. This isn't Shmuel. So these are Talmud. These are post-Talmudic period, but some of these are relatively, Shmuel is pretty recent after the close of the Mishnah. He says if he gives her the money and he says, your status is changed, good. But if he says, you are betrothed, if he gives her the money, but then he says, and I'm now your husband, I'm betrothed to you, right? He tries to change his own status. Nothing has happened. There is no legally binding commitment here. Okay. So now, if that's how marriage is created, where a man creates a claim on the woman, he takes some sort of, he by giving the money, he gets some sort of exclusive right over her, to her sexuality, to her childbearing, in some ways to her labor, but most particularly, right, sexual exclusivity. She cannot have a relationship with somebody else. All right, so then we're going to see, here's what a Jewish divorce looks like. This is what Rabbi Freller and I are studying together right now through the Rabbinical Assembly. And I should say, again, we're going back to the Mishnah. This is the earliest, but some of these things, these apply down to this day. To this day, go to a Jewish wedding and the man will hand the woman a ring and say, Hare at mekudeshet li b'tabat zo, you are betrothed to me with this ring, kedat Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the law of Moses in Israel. All right, if that's how you legally establish a marriage, though, then how would you legally undo one? Here's what the core, down to this day, of a Jewish divorce document, which is called a get, which is why the tractate is called gitin. That's just the plural. Here's what it says. Behold, you are permitted to any man. Right? And then this, in the original, in the Mishnah, this passage will be in Aramaic, but he says, right, this is your writ of divorce, because in Deuteronomy it says he gives a writ of divorce into her hand, right, a letter of dismissal, to go to marry any man you desire, right? So in essence, what did he claim from her at the wedding? He claimed exclusive right to her sexuality, to have a sexual relationship with her. And therefore, what happens in the divorce? He now releases her. He releases her. He created the bond. He can let it go. And what is letting that bond go? It's letting her now go marry anybody else. Right? And just to emphasize the point very quickly, this is another passage from the Mishnah, right? And because it is an act that the man does, the man releases the woman, right? Therefore, a man can only divorce if he so wishes. This becomes vital in later halakha, starting in about the medieval period. in which the kind of the requirements that we have to meet to be sure that a man is doing this of his own free will become quite stringent down to this day, right? So there's all kinds of problems, for example, in the Orthodox world, in the Israeli courts. If you put too much pressure on a man, then you have to start worrying that he's not doing this out of his own free will. Becomes a huge problem, right? But she, at least in this period, can be divorced against her will. I should say, right, that there's two other important things that happened in the medieval period, both in the name of a man by the name of Rabbeinu Gershom, or Hagolah, Rabbi Gershom, the light of the exile. And he put into place two things we call takanot, which particularly applied in his time to Ashkenazi communities, not Sephardi communities. Number one, he limited Jewish marriages to be monogamous from the man's side as well. In other words, no polygyny. Men will not marry multiple wives. I should note, though, that he basically said, you shouldn't do this, right? But he can't get around the fact that if a man who is married to one woman turns to another woman who is otherwise unattached, hands her an item and says, hooray, at Mikudeshet, he says the formula, we're going to have a problem. He will have violated Rabbeinu Gershom's ban, but he will technically be married to her, and the court will step in and try to make him give her a divorce. And there are even occasions down to this day where occasionally a court will find a loophole and will technically allow a man to take a second wife. As, for example, if a couple has been civilly divorced and the woman is utterly refusing to accept a divorce.
Just to add an anecdote there and give Rabbi Labovitz a second to take a breath. There was a case in Israel where a boy and a girl, and it really mean a boy and a girl, not a man and a woman, they were old enough that they were above bar and bat mitzvah, so they're Jewish adults. They were planning to have a marriage in school. And he actually gave her a gift. It wasn't like a gold ring or anything like that, but it was worth more than a pruta. Even if it's a fake ring, it would still had significant value. And he said exactly this formula forth to her in front of all the friends as they were playing it. And all those friends are also Jewish adults and were witnesses that happened. And people hearing the story actually went after that and said, you need to have a get. You need a divorce, because technically you just did the two things in front of witnesses. And even though you're just like teenagers, you're married to each other, and we need to fix that. That's how powerful those two things are, no matter what. Just in case, let's have a get.
If anybody has ever watched the series Stiesel, this figures, consciously, the people who are doing it know what they're doing, but this figures in the second season, and I won't say more than that. Okay, right, so that was number one thing. And then the other thing, which I already kind of hinted, the other thing Rabbeinu Gershom said is a woman shouldn't be divorced against her will. Now, again, there are some ways to get around that in really emergency situations. They aren't easy, but they exist, and they don't really exist for women. A man must do this of his own free will. So what do you think happens if a man can't or won't? Those are two slightly different situations. A man either can't or won't give a get. He can't because we don't know where he's gone off to. We don't know if he's dead or alive, or he's not mentally competent. He's, for whatever reason, he's not mentally competent to give a get. There are cases in Israel, a man has, a traumatic injury, let's say a car accident, a motorcycle accident, and he's essentially in a vegetative state. What do? He's alive, but, right? Alternately, the man simply refuses. What do you think happens?
You're all right. Nothing happens.
Nothing happens. She's stuck. Right. Some people, right. So there's a traditional Jewish term, an aguna. Literally, it means anchored. Literally means anchored, like you anchor a ship, right? And we traditionally use that for a woman when we just don't know where the man is. And you can imagine in the ancient world, that was an even more like pre-modern world, when you don't have, good mail service, when you don't have telegrams, when you don't have email, when you don't have phones, that can be a serious problem. It was actually a serious problem, for example, in early American history. A man would sail off to the New World, tell his family he's going to write to them and bring them as soon as he's got enough money, and they never hear from him again. Right? Or maybe eventually she tries to come and she manages to come, but they don't know where he's gone. He's disappeared into the wilds of America, and we don't know where he is or how to find him. Right? That's a little different, but like we don't know if he's dead or alive, right? Like that's, right? We don't know if he's dead or alive. Right? Now it also happens, right, that there will be cases in which a man actually actively is refusing. I won't give you a get unless you give me possession of the house, give me all the stocks, pay me $1 million, let me have full custody of the children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or just because I won't ever let her go. And some people distinguish and call women in that situation misuravot get. They're being denied a get. You might hear misurav, mikudeshet, misuravat, right? You might hear that it's that same passive. She is being denied a get. Be that as it may, right? The woman can't get out, right? So now, right, go back to your models of marriage that we discussed, half an hour or 45 minutes ago. Does any of this fit with what you would want a marriage to be? No, I don't think so. I think most of us would not think this way. We would not want this one-sided, right? We tend to, we think of our marriages in the modern era through mutuality, through mutual choice, mutual commitment. Okay, so very briefly, I want to talk about some modern takes and what does it take to make a marriage mutual, right? Okay, what happens if we just decide, all right, she's going to hand him a ring and she's going to say, Harei ata mikudashli, you're betrothed to me. What happens then? So number one here is a man by the name of Rabbi Isaac Klein. He was one of the great halakhic thinkers of the conservative movement in, let's say, kind of the mid 20th century, really at the heyday of conservative Judaism in America. And he wrote a book called A Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, which to this day, I know I personally use to teach conservative rabbinical students about what we call practical halakha, like the day in and day out of keeping a kosher kitchen, keeping Shabbat, observing the holidays, etc.
It's in my office if anyone needs it.
I have one copy at home and one copy in my office, right? This was the book that sort of preceded The Observant Life. So he says something interesting. He says, what would happen if the woman gives the man a ring? Well, right, some Orthodox authorities would say what happens is it becomes an exchange. It's not an acquisition anymore, right? If I say, here's $5 so that you'll give me, a couple of boxes of Girl Scout cookies, let's say, right? Like, and I go to the daughter of my very good friend, say, here's $5 and I'd like a box of Girl Scout cookies. And she gives me the box of Girl Scout cookies, right? But then she immediately also gives me back the $5, right? Have I bought the Girl Scout cookies from her? She's given them to me, or like right? Or we haven't, or basically I say, here's $5, and she gives me the box of cookies. We've had an equal exchange. We haven't had, right? I didn't ask for them, but like she gave me the cookies and said, like, whatever. We've had an exchange, not exactly a purchase. Right? We can barter things, especially if we're using something other than money, right? I give her a box of, I give her, I don't know, something worth $5, not $5. I give her a book, she gives me a box of cookies. We've traded something, whatever it is, right? So that's one reason why it might not work. But the other thing people say is, right, she shouldn't say that because it's just not true. She can't say, I am acquiring you. All right. But here's what Rabbi Klein says. Some people object, right? But he says, nope, she can do it. She can give him a ring under the chuppah, and she can say, Harei ata mikudashli, you are betrothed to me. Why? Because once he has acquired her, that's the legally important act, right? And that's binding. That's done. And so he says, whatever is added is of no legal significance. That's my emphasis. I grant you that, right? But I think it's important to note, right, that even in the conservative movement, when rabbis are letting couples do this, it's an open question whether what she is doing, it looks lovely, it feels more mutual to the couple for sure, right? And they may between them feel that they are making mutual commitments to each other. But in terms of the legality of the marriage, and more importantly, what's going to happen if you want to break it up, if you, God forbid, you have to break it up, right? It hasn't changed anything. It's of no legal significance. All right, I just want to show you very quickly. I'm going to skim over these, but these are two critiques of.
I just want to confirm something, maybe to help all of us understand a little bit. In the weddings we have currently going on, and the man says, "Hareyat mekudesh li betabat zo kedat Moshe ve'Israel." Everything is in place. And then what happens many times is that she says to him, "Hareyata mekudash li betabat zo kedat Moshe ve'Israel," and that makes a beautiful egalitarian looking, but without an egalitarian significance. That makes sense?
Yes, and by the way, I should add, this is the point of argument between me and Rabbi Barmash. Rabbi Barmash would like to make it so that when Jews get married, that Jews ought to do this mutually. But she hasn't yet worked out what would that mean for divorce. And so my critique of her work is basically, you've created an egalitarian ceremony, but you haven't created an egalitarian marriage. And so I should be clear, one of the things I say in my tshuva is that for me, the only way that I have achieved my purpose is if it's not only a ceremony that is egalitarian, right, but that both of the couple, right, that the whole marriage itself is formed on an egalitarian basis, which must mean that it can be undone in an egalitarian way. If it should need to be undone, so A, it has to be egalitarian. B, it has to be binding, which I'll come back to very, very shortly. It has to have some legal basis to make it binding. But the very fact that it's binding, one of the ways you know something is binding is because you have to legally undo it. Right? Again, think about my issue of the couple who got engaged and then decide they don't want to go ahead and get married. Right? And they just walk away. It's even similar. A couple could be living together for any amount of time. And at some point they decide they want to break up. There's really no legal process that they need to go through to end their relationship. They may need to negotiate the lease of their apartment. They might, want to figure out how to divvy up their property, but it's going to be tough for them to divvy up their property because they never did anything legally to combine their property. It's going to be much harder to go to the courts and get the courts to help you divide up your property because you didn't do anything legally to combine it in the first place. Right? So the very fact that you have to undo something often says that, yes, you did something in the first place that was binding. So, right, my ceremony, whatever it is I'm going to come up with, has to be mutual in the ceremony. It has to be binding, and then it has to be, and binding is demonstrated by the fact that you're going to have to undo it, but it has to be undone, right? The fact that you have to undo it, there's going to have to be a way to undo it, and it's going to have to also be something that either party can initiate, and that neither party can hold the other prisoner. Yes, okay, so somebody notes what I've seen conservative weddings where the woman says a Torah verse, or she says something like, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li, right? There are people who don't even want her to say Harei mikudesh, Atarei ata mikudash li, precisely because it is problematic, because it doesn't do anything. So for example, Moshe Feinstein, who's one of the great legal thinkers of the Orthodox movement, at sort of precisely the same time that Isaac Klein is working in the conservative movement, he says, he takes a position, interestingly, very similar to Klein's. You could do it because nothing happens, right? Nothing happens if you do it, but you still shouldn't do it precisely because you don't want people to get the wrong idea that you really ought to be doing it, or that something happens. You don't want people to get the wrong idea that something does happen. So therefore, she shouldn't say this because it's deceiving the onlookers, right? That something should happen when she says it. But I think, right, there are plenty of Orthodox rabbis who will allow a woman to give a man a ring, maybe at that point in the ceremony or at another point in the ceremony, so that it's very clear, that it's a different part of the ceremony, and let her say something. Anila Dodi. At my own wedding, I said Anila Dodi Vadodi Li. I would do it differently now.
Before we move into the next part, I just want to add a disclaimer there that I think we haven't talked so far. We were talking about he and she the whole time, not because we're not acknowledging the existence of weddings of two he's or two she's or any other pronoun you want to add there, but because this whole system was created, meant, and only works as of right now to a man and a woman.
Well, as of up to 2006 in the conservative movement.
Yeah.
But thank you. That's a hugely important piece of this.
Yeah,
right?
So it only works for them. And now part of how, and I think it's brilliant what Rabbi Labovitz is going to bring is that part of the solution she's going to bring has to do with the solution that we find for same-sex couples can maybe help us to rethink that. So that's why the whole reason we haven't talked about same-sex couple yet is because we're not talking about them. We're actually talking about...
Yeah. See, I think one of the interesting things that happens, and one of the things that has happened with the move to allow same-sex marriage, or even marriage that is completely not dependent on gender, right? Is precisely that it pointed up how gendered our ideas of marriage are. This is both Jewishly and I think more broadly. Right. So, for example, you hear same-sex couples talking about the concept like, well, who's going to propose to who? Right. And you hear of, for example, same-sex couples, arranging these elaborate things in which one proposes to the other and then the other one proposes back to the first one. Right. Because how did we decide how this happens? Right. Like we sort of somehow decide the man proposes to the woman. I want you to know, by the way, that I proposed to my husband. Not entirely seriously. We knew I think there are a lot of couples who talk about this and just sort of work out like, yes, we're getting married. And then the proposal is kind of a formality. But, right, we still have an idea like a man's supposed to propose to a woman. Right? We have all these gendered ideas about how marriage works. And when we started to think about couples who aren't in our classic heterosexual combinations getting married, we suddenly went, wait, why do those roles have to be gendered? Right. And I think, in an interesting sort of way, the fact that we as a movement started to think about how gay and lesbian couples, how same-sex couples could get married, right? So in 2006, we passed the tshuva that allowed for equality, in leadership roles and in ritual and in everything. And then as a corollary to that, right, the rabbis who wrote that tshuva, Rabbis Elliot Dorff, Daniel Nevins, and Avram Reisner, then wrote another tshuva on what a marriage should look like, right? And it's, in a way, it's the very fact that now, right, like if I were to have a sister, I don't, but if I were, right, who wanted to marry another woman, she could, right, as at the time that tshuva got passed, actually have a more egalitarian ceremony than I had with my husband in 1988. Right, which is so I started this tshuva basically saying I want to create a place in which, a differing sex couple can have a marriage between equals. Now, it also so happens, right, that any ceremony I created here, or I shouldn't even say I created, any ceremony I worked into the halachic system because I used ideas that came from other people, also work for couples of any two gender combinations, right? A non-binary person and a woman. Two men, right? Two non-binary people, a trans woman and a born man. Any two Jews who are otherwise free to be married to each other. In other words, they aren't related to each other. Neither of them is previously married, etc. Right? They're both halachically Jewish. Any two Jews who want to get married to each other can use what I've done here. Right? So, I'm focusing on men and women. But, right, sort of underlying and running kind of, underneath all of this is, yes, it will work for any two Jews who want to get married. Right. And so, right, so notice, right, so now here, notice the critique of when Rabbis Dorff, Nevin, and Reisner go to create a ceremony for same-sex couples, right? Things evolve, right? Like, in the time that they're writing this tshuva, we're thinking of same-sex. Now we're thinking about intersex and transgender and non-binary, right? Like we keep moving, right? But they say, right? We don't want to call it Kiddushin, right? It's inherently not, and why don't we want to use it for this? Because it's inherently non-egalitarian, right? It's one way, right? It also creates the problem of, right, the agunah, right? Here is this, right? It creates great suffering, right? And it's gender specific, right? Who's going to betroth who, right? So they just say basically there's a practical problem, and they create a different sort of ceremony. Now it's interesting. They create a ceremony in which the person says, you are my life partner. You are my life partner, which actually, if we go back to he says something to her that changes her status, could actually be problematic if used by differing sex couples. I'm not sure their ceremony. And by the way, two of the three of them agreed with me on that. I didn't check with Rabbi Dorf, but both Rabbis Nevins and Reisner said to me explicitly in emails, no, you shouldn't use it for differing sex couples. You'll just create Kiddushin. Here is a more thoroughgoing critique, however. This is Rachel Adler.
Can I ask a quick question, actually, about the
please.
previous tshuva that we just looked at? Do you know, knowing those rabbis personally, do you know if they were like opening a door, basically, to then having Kiddushin re-examined by writing this piece so explicitly?
They very explicitly tried not to do that. I'm going to look, see, I have my copy of my tshuva here. I have to just see if I can find where I have that cited, right? So they wrote, this is what they wrote in their tshuva. Well, some heterosexual couples may see in these new models of Brit and Shutafut, covenant and partnership, which they're taking from Rachel Adler, but we'll talk about that in a moment, right? They may see in these new models for same-sex couples a basis for abandoning the traditional model of Kiddushin, right? While they might do that, conservative Judaism has taught us to respect ancient liturgy and to minimize modifications of text, focusing on interpretive evolution, right? So that's they don't want to give up Kiddushin. They're not quite ready to go that step. I think they might also be aware of, what that might do to what votes they're going to get. Dirty little secret of all this, right, is you write your vote because you actually want to influence something, but you also have to get them passed in the law committee, and you have to know what the boundaries. And I mean, in a way, I think that's a good thing also, right? Because the law committee then, as a committee, serves as kind of here's how far, like, we feel like we all are ready to go at this point, and here's where we're not ready to go as a community. And it does actually help us decide as a community what are our boundaries. But so here's what I wrote right after that. I quoted that, and then I wrote, in taking it upon myself to write this tshuva, I therefore want to state at the outset that despite my own reservations regarding Kiddushin that I have just amply described, I accept that a statement such as this remains valid for many of my rabbinic colleagues and for the couples whose marriages they are privileged to officiate for. Those who wish to continue to perform marriages and be married through Kiddushin may readily claim history and tradition to ground their practice. The conservative Masorti approach to halacha does and must recognize such commitments to longstanding practice, to longstanding law and practice as valid. Right? So like I have to accept as a conservative Jew, there are going to be some people who want to do that. But for all the problems that I've kind of outlined, and because of the critique that we're about to see from Rachel Adler, I have some serious questions about whether
just moving into her work. I had this conversation with Rabbi Dorf, and I asked him a similar question. And just so everyone understands how the votes work that Rabbi Labovitz was talking about, throughout the time it changed, but at that time and still to this day, we have 25 voting people, and that tshuva passed 13 against 12. So just
which tshuva, the original one on gays, lesbians, or the ones on marriage?
I think the original one.
Yeah, I think the one on marriage passed with more votes, but I don't remember.
Because that was already a year later, and was already a little bit different. But the first one,
it was several years later, actually.
Right? Yeah, that was 13 and 12. And I asked Rabbi Dorf, had 3 people writing. There are some places that are not that great. What happened there? And his answer to me was like, we just had to pass it.
Yeah.
He was of the group that understood that not every single thing that is written there would be the ideal case, and this probably would be one of those examples of still keeping an unbalanced relationship between men and women was not the goal of that tshuva. So that's where they had to give up, right? We're not gonna go too far because then we might not allow all the gays and lesbians who are needing the recognition that we're here to give to them because of a minor point here or point there. So they try to limit the amount of conflict in those side things and focus in one topic and pass that to be done with that. That which I think it has its weight as well. It is troubling. We wish we could have been more expensive at that time, but it has its value as well in doing its job.
Yeah, and if I'm reading my own notes correctly, so the original tshuva that basically allowed, for example, for gays and lesbians to come to rabbinical school and so on, that was 2006. And I think that the follow-up tshuva on marriage was 2011. I think. Okay, so very quickly, the critique of Rachel Adler, and then we're going to jump to what I actually did, the ceremonies that I came up with. Right, so here's Rabbi Adler's, Rabbi Doctor. Very interesting. Just from an ethical perspective, the double ring ceremony is a dubious amelioration. The problem with marital kinyan is not simply that it is unilateral, but that it commodifies human beings, right? Turns human beings into commodities, into things, into property. The groom's commodification and acquisition of the bride is not rectified by the bride's retaliation in kind. Right? In other words, is this the metaphor we want to be using at all? Never mind making it mutual. Fine, we make it mutual, but is this a good metaphor? Right? The vocabulary and constitutive assumptions of Kiddushin cannot be made to reflect a partnership of equals. Is what we are doing in marriage something we do to each other? Okay, so now I'm going to skip a bunch of pages here. This is all the in between, like how do we get to maybe we can even do this? And we're going to go to what I actually proposed. And I encourage you to look at the other stuff. And if you have questions and you want to email me at any point, I'm on the AJU website. I'm very easy to find. Just say, I was in Rabbi Freller's class and I really want to talk to you more. And I will be happy to. Okay. So now this is actually an in-between position, I would say. And it's a response, actually, it is framed in part as a response to Dr. Adler's position. This is Rabbi David Greenstein. He is a conservative rabbi, colleague of ours. I've met him a couple of times, not many. Hold on one second, I just want to check one thing. Make sure there's not okay, just Rabbi Freller put the thing back up. And he's put up my address, so you can find my address there. Okay, right? So he says, right, if what's happening in Kiddushin, what is it that the man acquires when he acquires a woman, right? And we've said sort of first and foremost, although not only, the first and foremost, what he acquires is kind of this exclusive claim on her. Much like, for example, the temple acquires an exclusive claim on something when you make it hekdesh. He acquires an exclusive claim over her. Right? Ownership. And Rabbi Greenstein says an interesting thing. Well, actually, we do kind of feel this way about our partners. In our modern context, we tend to think of, right, marriage as, we tend to engage in monogamous marriages. Judaism is encouraging us to have monogamous marriages. And we do tend to feel a claim on, right? Like I have a claim to my husband's emotional, not just sexual, but emotional exclusivity. The kind of relationship he has with me, he shouldn't have with anybody else. And vice versa, right? We do feel a kind of claim, right? But it works in both directions, right? I feel like I have a certain kind of claim on him, but I fully and openly and eagerly acknowledge that he has that claim on me. Right? That's the whole point, right? I also don't want to create that sort of relationship with anybody else but him, right? And this is going to be very, very crucial to what Rabbi Greenstein's about to do, right? That sense of, it's not just that I have claimed exclusivity from my partner, but I've given it to my partner. If I feel the sense of a claim on my partner's exclusivity, it's because my partner has given it to me, not because I have taken it, but because the whole reason he is my partner is because he has given it to me. Right? Right? And so he wants to reclaim Kiddushin, that sense of set aside, Kiddushin as set aside, as exclusive, right? To find a way in which it's not something we impose one on the other, but something we give one to the other. Okay, so as a background, before I go to what it is he's actually proposing, you need to just see this one little source of background. This is Maimonides, who is one of the great Jewish legal thinkers of the medieval period. He's living in Egypt in, I think, the 10th century, I think it is. 10th or 11th, but I think it's 10th. And he writes one of the great codes of Jewish law, right, called the Mishneh Torah. And here's what he says in his laws of marriage, right? So if she gives him the money, right? Right, and remember, we've seen this in the Toscefta, and we've seen this in the Talmud. We've seen variants of this. She gives the money and she says, "I am betrothed to you," right? I am whatever, right? Or any language, right? Right? She is not betrothed, right? He has to say, right? The words which the man says, right? It must be that he is acquiring. We've already talked about that. He has to be the active party, and he has to be doing something to her status. Right? And he can't say, I am bestowing myself to you. He can't say, I'm your husband, right? He can't bestow himself to her. Okay, so here now is what Greenstein is going to do. He's going to flip this all around. He's going to say, you know what? Maimonides says, if I bestow myself to my partner, or my partner bestows himself to me, there's no Kiddushin. So he says, great. That's what we ought to do. We can hold on to the language of Kiddushin. We will each bestow ourselves, as it were, to the other, which is how we think about in the modern context what it is we're doing, right? I am freely and joyously giving myself and my exclusivity to you. That's what I think many of us think is one of the core pieces of a marriage. That's what I'm doing, right? And we already have the halachic imprimatur, as it were, or anti-imprimatur. That won't be Kiddushin. If you do that, you can't accidentally or deceive, you can't end up with Kiddushin, because that's a formula that simply does not create Kiddushin. And so what you should say, again, back to our binyanim and Hebrew grammar, back to our forms, we're going to use a form called the hitpa'el now, which is a reflexive form and a form of doing something to myself. And I'm going to say, Hare ani mitkadeshet. I am betrothing myself to you. And the man will say, Hare ani mitkadesh lach or lecha. Right? I am betrothed. And again, right, I can say it. I am betrothing myself to a man. I am betrothing myself to a non-binary person. I am betrothing myself to another woman. I'm betrothing myself to my partner. And my partner is betrothing him or herself to me, right? And we'll use a ring, and that's what we'll say. And we won't have created Kiddushin. All right, so that meets requirement number 1 of my tshuva, no Kiddushin, right? Because I have not figured out how to redeem Kiddushin in a way that makes it really honestly mutual, right? If I ever figure it out, I'll come back to you, right? But I haven't figured that out yet. Here's the problem. What makes it binding instead? Right? There's no acquisition. There's just, all right, so you might just say, well, I gave myself, I committed, right? That in and of itself, I wanted it to be binding. You wanted it to be binding. Maybe that's enough. That is kind of Rabbi Greenstein's answer. But he also falls back on a version of another answer that Rabbis Dorff, Nevins, and Reisner give in their tshuva, again, about same-sex marriages. What's going to make our same-sex marriages binding? We've never had such a thing in halakha. We've been against such a thing for thousands of years in halakha. What's going to make it binding now? All right. And so they have kind of 2 interlocking answers. One is rabbinic authority. Rabbis say so. Right? There is an element of, rabbis they're kind of jurists, but they're also kind of legislators in halakha. So at a certain point, rabbis can get together and say, we all agree that this is what's the halakha now, And if enough of us agree, this is the halacha. So that's point number one.
And in particular about marriage, right? Because marriage is a rabbinic creation, to speak. Adata de Rabbanan Mekadesh. If we have to annul a wedding, we can, because
Yes, there is a principle in halacha that people write betrothed on the understanding of the rabbis, which is that basically the rabbis get to kind of put their gushpanka, on the wedding and say, yes, that was done kosher. No, that wasn't. And if a rabbi says, no, it wasn't done right, done, it's not. Right. So we can say, yes, we say that that's binding. And if you do it exactly this way, and we look at it, we see you did everything right, you're bound to each other. Right. So that's point number one. And then point number two is they suggest you can use documents to essentially seal a relationship between two people. Right. And so they create a document for that. Right. And by signing the document and having the document witnessed, that also creates a binding commitment. Okay. So that's Rabbi Greenstein trying to kind of redeem something from Kiddushin. But remember that Rabbi Dr. Adler is not having that. So she creates something different.
Just a question on the previous one before we move.
Yeah.
With that answer, taking from that tshuva, that establishing Kedat Moshe Israel and tying through that phrase with rabbinic tradition and having a document of idkadshut, of that partnership, isn't that enough for you to make it binding? Why don't you
Well,
use...
no, but basically, right, in my tshuva, so what I thought was that in his article in which he proposes this, I didn't feel like he had addressed that quite as much as I felt like I wanted to, right? He kind of falls back on the rabbis say so, and the couple agrees to it. So I added, and by the way, right, we already have a precedent in the conservative movement whereby the document makes something binding. So let's add that in here, right? That's kind of my addition to my tshuva, right? The combination of we as a committee are saying, yes, we agree to this, and the couple has signed the document, that is sufficient to make it binding. So yes, I do think when they sign the document, that makes it binding.
I love that you're using as a precedent the exact same text that says you shouldn't be doing what you're doing.
Well, no, what's important for that as a precedent is that basically it says, and it can't be Kiddushin, right? It's very important that you not do anything that can even kind of remotely deceive somebody looking at it to think it's Kiddushin, because then you might end up with doubtful Kiddushin, and then you might have them forced into the situation of needing a get. That's very, and I even have them, as part of my ceremony, I have them say during the ceremony, and we're not doing Kiddushin, just to be clear, what we're doing here is not Kiddushin. And it can either be they say, or the rabbi can say, and do you agree that what we're doing? And they both say yes. And okay. All right, so here is Adler. And so I just want to really, all I want to point out here is what she says kind of basically is her, right? What does she think should be her model, right? Her first metaphor is covenant. Remember, we've been talking about what are your metaphors, right? Again, right, so if you were starting from scratch, right, you don't have Kiddushin, and you wanted to take the metaphor that you gave me earlier, right? Partnership, or, a task together, or a pooling of resources, right? What kind of a ceremony would you create out of that? Right, so Adler stops, just, okay, what's my metaphor? What metaphor do I want? Maybe a metaphor of a covenant between two people. And there's a lot of complicated stuff here. She talks about what's the difference between a covenant and a contract that I'm not going to go into here, right? But she's pulling on all the metaphors, right, by the way, of God and Israel being in a covenant. Covenant is also important because sometimes, we break the covenant, but the covenants can still stand, right? We commit idolatry, but God still loves us, and we're still going to find a way, right? That's part of what's very important to her about the metaphor of covenant, right? And covenants have mutual obligations and so on. So her first metaphor is covenant, right? So they have a document that makes the covenant. But then she's going to pull on another metaphor, the metaphor of partnership. And here's why she's going to pull on this metaphor. Because here we can actually pull on a legal mechanism that already exists in halakha. And that is people make partnerships, people make business partnerships, right? How do you make a business partnership traditionally in Jewish law? And this is Maimonides again, but he's also drawing on another source very, very early in the Toscefta, right? But I didn't think I needed to give you both because they say basically the same thing, right? What do? I take some assets and I drop them in, like, we take like a bag or a money purse or something, and I drop some of my money in, and you drop some of your money in. And we kind of, we lift it up together and we go, right now, this belongs to both of us and we're now partners, right? And that then means, right, that we divvy up, right, through the partnership, we divvy up the assets of that partner, the profits of that partnership, however we've agreed, 50-50, right? Even if I put in $100 and you put in 500, but we agreed, we're equal partners, right? Because, you bring the money, but I bring the brains or whatever it is. Right. And, and our business takes off and we sell at our IPO for, $100 a share. Right. And we divvy that up equally. Right. But the mechanism, the traditional mechanism, this isn't necessarily how it's done in halakha today, but the traditional mechanism was I put something in, you put something in, we lift it up together and we're partners. So here are the things that Rabbi Adler is going to take from this. Right? First of all, partnerships have to be made by mutual agreement. Right? You can't force me into a partnership. You can't impose a partnership on me. We each have to contribute something. And we have to both agree to invest in this partnership. Right? And when we do that, neither of us acquires the other. What do we acquire? But we acquire rights and responsibilities towards each other. We acquire, as it were, the partnership itself and all the commitments and responsibilities that go with that, but we don't acquire each other. And because we've each entered it by mutual agreement, either one of us can leave it, right, when we choose, if we feel we need to. That's also important. Another thing that Rabbi Greenstein doesn't really talk about very much is how are you going to end one of his commitments. By the way, the name Heat Cut Shoot, I added, and I got it from a fellow member of this law committee who happened to have been Rabbi Avram Reisner. He suggested that name. I liked it. I went back to Rabbi Greenstein and said, can I use this? And Rabbi Greenstein said, fine. Okay, right? So here's the ceremony, right? Right? Each partner takes something of value to them. Now, it could be rings, but it could also be, let's say, right, I'm a Talmudist and my husband is a lawyer, right? So I take a volume of Shas, because that's something that belongs to me. And he takes his Black's Law Dictionary or whatever. He takes, the nameplate that's on his office because now he's a partner at a big law firm and he's very, right, and that matters to him. And we each put those things into the bag together and we lift them up and we're partners. We are legally partners. And what's even better about this in a way is this is the classical form. Nowadays in halakha, you can make partnerships in other ways, right? But it doesn't look like kiddushin. You can do the rings, but it doesn't look like kiddushin. It can't be mistaken really for kiddushin. And it can be very, very meaningful to use something, right, that matters to you. I actually did the wedding for my brother and sister-in-law this way. And sadly, I don't remember exactly what they put in. But I know that at least at one point, one of the things my brother was thinking about, my brother and I have this thing about, it happens to be the anniversary on the Gregorian calendar, the day of my mom's death. So I said, here's the thing about, like, he'll find pennies and he always thinks like those are little gifts from mom. He'll find them at important times and in significant places. And he was thinking about putting a little collection of those pennies in. Right. But I don't remember what he actually ended up choosing. I think maybe it was a piece of his artwork. Something very, but like you can feel like it could be like really, really deeply significant. I'm giving you something. I'm putting in to our partnership something that deeply says who I am. A musician could put their instrument in. An artist could put a piece of their artwork, right? I could put a copy of my book in, for example, right? And so that's what you do. You put them in, you lift it, and that's how you create the ceremony. And so what I should say is, right, basically for both of these ceremonies, these two acts, whether you're doing the heat cut shoot, you're giving the rings and saying, I am betrothing myself, or whether you're doing this, putting the things in a bag and lifting it, those would go into what basically the ceremony we already have for a Jewish wedding, but in the place in which you would do the kiddushin, instead you do this. So, right, so you have everybody comes down the aisle, however you want to do it. If one party wants to circle the other, or they both want to circle, you can, or you do or don't have to do that. You can welcome them with the traditional welcome, Baruch haba, b'shem, right? You can welcome them with all the traditional words of welcome. I even suggest that there should be a blessing before, although I wrote a new blessing because the blessing that we have is very specific to Kiddushin, and it's an incredibly androcentric blessing. If you ever actually go read a literal translation of it, it's a deeply, deeply androcentric blessing in which the man who was officiating the wedding is speaking to the groom and the other men in the room, and he's not actually speaking to any of the women in the room. So I rewrote that blessing, but I think you should have a blessing for this moment. And then the couple does this altered ceremony. Then you can read the document, you can sign the document. Like there's different practices between Ashkenazim and Sephardim about how the ketubah functions here. The rabbi can speak to the couple, and then you actually go and say the Sheva Brachot in the same way the 7 blessings that we would say nowadays at a wedding. Rabbi Adler has a long piece in her book about why those are still okay, even though some of the imagery there might be problematic. And you can break a glass at the end, etc., and they're married. And the last but not least, the last little piece here is just to be clear, right? What does it mean? How are you going to undo these marriages, right? Because if part of my whole point is what shows that it's binding is that you have to undo it. And if part of the point is it has to be something you can undo in a mutual, not even a mutual, but in neither party can hold the other hostage. So here's what you do, right? It can be done at the initiative of either partner, right? And what do they do? They go to a Beit Din. A Beit Din oversees this, and the Beit Din says yes, which, by the way, is very similar, I think, to what happens in an American court, right? Technically, the court dissolves your marriage. You go to a court, you sue for divorce. The court divvies up all your stuff and makes all the arrangements and makes sure that everything is legally decided between you what's going to happen. And then the court declares that your marriage is over, which is not what happens in Jewish law, right? In Jewish law, the husband ends the marriage. Now, the court is there to make sure that all the procedures are done properly. The court is essential to this process, but the court does not dissolve the marriage. The court has no ability to dissolve the marriage if the husband doesn't give the say-so. Right? So here, right, that's the court is actually dissolving the marriage. The court, and if you want, right, you can have the Jewish court help you divvy up your property. You can do it through your secular lawyers, or you can have a Beit Din help you decide issues of custody, issues of, right, they can be mediators if you want that and they want that. And in the end, they write up a document in Hebrew attesting to everything that happened and how it was done, right? And then the couple, and it's signed by kosher witnesses, and then this Jewish marriage that was not Kiddushin is dissolved. And once more, I go back to Rabbis Dorff, Nevins, and Reisner. They composed a lovely document that can be used for same-sex couples, so I saw no reason to create something different or new. I just said basically their document is the document, right? And again, right, the court could modify this, the court could add the provisions, right? This dissolves the marriage, and they have agreed that they will, the children will be raised in this way, and they will have this kind of visitation, and the property will be divvied that way. The court can put that all in if they want, or they can just say, and all the other arrangements have been made by the secular courts, whatever, but this will dissolve the Jewish marriage. And the last point I would make is that in the same way that we actually already had longstanding, on the books, as it were, for the conservative movement, I, as a rabbi, cannot do a marriage until I have ensured that the parties to this marriage have not been previously married Jewishly, right? Or that if they have been married Jewishly, that their marriage has been properly dissolved. And I will say honestly, even though he's my brother and I love him and I trust him when he says yes, he did, I actually asked him, just please provide me the letter confirming that you gave your first wife a get, right? Which he did, right? Because just as a professional matter, I need to do that. And so the last piece of my tshuva basically said, and yes, if a couple has been married by one of my ceremonies, one of the ceremonies that we have, I didn't even say mine, they're not mine, they're Dr. Green, they're Rabbi Greenstein's and Rabbi Adler's, but one of the ones that I put into the tshuva and got endorsed by the law committee, if a couple is married by one of these ceremonies, that person neither of them can be remarried either by another of these ceremonies or by Kiddushin until they have done this process. Right? They must do this process in the same way that a couple married by Kiddushin must do a get.
which also proves your point that it must be binding. And then to regulate that you need a way out, you're also attesting again your belief that this is a binding model.
Right. So that's my truth. That's the heart of it. I'm happy to take some questions or stick around and chat for a little bit. But I know I'm exactly at 5:30, so 5:30 my time, 8:30 your time. I appreciate that you all have hung in with me for an hour and a half already. But I'm happy to take some questions or some comments or some conversation. And why don't I stop the screen share so that we can actually see each other again?
First of all, thank you so much for taking the time and being with us tonight. I think I heard you already talking about that multiple times, but never in that depth that we went today. So thank you. And I know that maybe some people have to go, but I talked to Rabbi Labovitz before. We're welcome to stay a little bit longer if anyone have any more questions about that. So I'm gonna stop recording right now.
And again, my email is in the chat. So